there's
no
a sheet
class
you
after
might have
this one.
noticed glued into this. What's that?
You have no class after this one, so you're
Alright.
free until 4 o'clock.
Alright, I'm still going to try and let you guys go pretty quick here. This is a whole other fencing treatise on a single sheet of paper, a fairly large one, that was glued into a copy of Meyer that's in Czech Republic. I actually made a replica of that for this book, which is done so that it folds out. And that's how it is in the book that it's in. After we found, so it's like about this big, and someone put it in there. After we found this, I've since found one other copy of this single sheet in a copy of Heinrich von Gundroth's book in Switzerland. Which is interesting because it makes references to a diagram in a bunch of places, which is actually put by Heinrich von Gundroth in his own manuscript. So we using this stuff we found in copies of Meyer, we've tried to piece together what this strange teaching about circle fencing might be. We just based on these individual sheets of paper in random books, one of which is Meyer. There's a copy in Augsburg that has the inside fly leaves covered in notes about fencing. But unfortunately, a lot of this is so faded that it's unreadable. So Olivier Dupuis is trying to transcribe it. He says there's a lot of Italian fencing terms mixed in, but a lot of it is just not clear enough to be read. Despite all the filtering we've done, we even had the library try and use different kinds of light against it to try and reveal more text. But a lot of it is just too smeared and too faded. But whoever owned this copy was writing down possibly comparisons of Meyer to Italian fencing. And then there are also interesting diagrams in some of the margins like this, where they took Meyer's 8 cutting lines and copied them into the margin here, because this paragraph is where he described what each line is. And the picture's on a different page, so they wanted to add it there. This is a copy in Munich. And here, somebody very proudly wrote Hoc fecit at the bottom, which means I did this after doing all of this. I kind of wonder if this is, again, maybe a child. They certainly, put some energy into this color job, but this same copy, by the way, has a bunch of really terrible underlining, like this, where it kind of crosses out partly the things being underlined, and it's mostly not whole sentences, so who knows what they were doing with that, as well as some really cryptic marginal notes, like this, JF34P1, which are probably references to a different book, but I've been through every fencing manual, and none of them actually line up with possible things they could be referring to. So I have no idea what they were trying to cross-reference here, but through most of the longsword guards, you have these notes in the margins. So why are we doing all this? This is part of the wrap-up. Well, what I really wanted to find, without looking through all these books, was evidence of an actual student, somebody who actually cared about Meyer's fencing teachings as fencing teachings. For other fencing manuals of this time period, we can find copies that actually have student notes in them. This is a copy of Giganti, I believe, in the second edition, where almost every page has these notes in the margin, which Jeff von Steenkunst, I think his name is, I'm probably butchering that, whatever, who did the Giganti translation for Wichtenauer. It's von something. He transcribed all of these and translated them. A lot of them are intelligent notes talking about things that Giganti is talking about. This is not just ramblings. This is somebody who knew fencing discussing Giganti's teachings. Likewise, the treatise of Hans Wilhelm Schoeffer from 1620 has extensive handwritten notes throughout by a student who is familiar with his teachings. And even in this particular copy, which I want to say is in Göttingen, has 100 pages inserted into the middle between book 1 and book 2, full of handwritten notes. an entire fencing treatise that someone wrote into the middle of this book of their own. And I was hoping for Meyer, we might actually find a copy of his book that was full of similar notes about somebody who was discussing his fencing in his own time period. For a brief, exciting moment, I thought maybe we had. The copy of the second edition in Berlin has a bunch of pictures that were cut out, but then later on, somebody replaced them all with hand-traced pictures, replacing the ones that were missing, and also hand-wrote in all of the missing text from those pages. They put extensive notes through the entire sword section and sporadically through the rest of the book, doing like little diagrams, underlinings, little notes like this, discussing things, cross-referencing, sometimes pointing out Meyer's math errors, where he's like, here's 13 things, and it's only 12, or it's 14. And then, unfortunately, what I discovered is this is actually the copy that was owned by Karl was Mansdorf, who was a very famous, or at least well-known 19th century sport historian, who was very into understanding historical fighting, owned tons of fencing manuals, and wrote especially about historical wrestling. But he also owned this copy of Meyer, and all these notes were written by him in the 1800s, not by somebody in the 1600s, sadly. I'm still looking, though. There are... Oh, what the heck happened here? I think we had a sudden font size emergency happen here. There are 8 libraries that haven't responded to my inquiries, and they should all fit on this thing, except somehow the font got too big. There are still more copies of Meyer out there that nobody knows what's in them. 1 or 2 copies that basically said, nah, we can't check it, sorry. That book is in a part of the library that's remote, and you need permission to go get it out, and they basically flatly refuse to let me see it or to scan it. There is still hope that in one of these copies, or other copies in private collections, we might find the thing we're looking for, which is evidence of what anybody historically thought of Meyer's teachings or how they would modify them. There are still questions we haven't answered, like how many books were there originally? We don't know. Chris Van Slambrook, just by looking at the records of normal print outputs, says there probably was between 300 and 1,200 copies originally. That's a pretty wide window that we need to narrow down somehow. But even if there were 300 originally, that means we only have a fraction of what once existed, and might still exist. And any one of those could have interesting things that would help us understand Meyer better. We also need to do a lot more research on what's called provenance, which means who owned this book in the past, and where did they get it, who did they give it to? Provenance is the study of sort of the chain of ownership from the beginning all the way to the present. And then also doing a lot more analysis of all the little fingerprints and smears and food stains and little one-word notes in these books to try to figure out if there's information there about about when people were reading it, which parts got read more, and so on.
When they read it, write it too. Like when they wrote it too.
Yeah. What time period it
like
was.
the orthography and the...
So now that we have all these scans, there's a lot more work along those lines to figure out exactly how much we can glean from that information in the absence of really extensive handwritten notes, which I would love to find. Here's all the people who helped with this so far. There's a lot of HEMA folks who've gone to libraries and helped with information, and also a bunch of libraries and curators who were very helpful as well. And what time we got now? We can do 1 or 2 funny quotes about Joachim Meyer, why not? Heinrich von Gunderoth is the guy who was the Duke of Mecklenburg's fencing master about 10 years after Meyer died. And he wrote a book. He was basically a hotshot, like 20-year-old at this time, who wrote a book about academic fencing. And he was very proud of his humanist education. He wrote in Latin. He quoted Aristotle and things like that. And what he says about Meyer is, a few years ago, a certain man from Strasbourg, known as Joachim Meyer, tried to show certain rules and even published a big volume in the German language about this art. And though he seemed to have understood a little bit, he did not make clear the practical use of the fundamentals, which are big words from somebody who copied Meyer's pictures into his own book. This is Heinrich von Gunderoth's manuscript, which replicates a whole bunch of Meyer's pictures. So apparently, even though he only understood a little bit, he was still worth replicating. There are 2 Italian masters who mention Joachim Meyer in their list of important fencing masters of the past. That's
Joachim Meyer
and Marcelli. They don't really give us much information, but the cream of the crop when it comes to people who talked about Meyer is Luis Pacheco de Narvaez, who was an a Spanish destreza master and was the supreme fencing master of the Kingdom of Spain for a number of years. And he wrote tons of books about all kinds of stuff. But the most interesting one is in 1629, no, 25, sorry, this is a funny 5. He writes a manuscript called Nueva Ciencia y Filosofía de la Destreza de las Armas, the New Science and Philosophy of the Skill at Arms, which was not published until after he died in 1672. But he has, very handily at the beginning of his book, a list of everybody who he's going to throw shade at in the whole book, which is all the authors. Like, basically, the thing to know about Pacheco is he hated everybody, except his own fencing teacher, Geronimo Sanchez de Carranza. And even he gets insulted, but like only a little bit compared to everybody else. Pacheco was very much of the opinion that nobody knew how to fence but him. But he says, towards the beginning of the book, we find 8 authors to be the first seminarians of this sect, a disfigured and horrendous monster who men have venerated. The 5, he's talking about the corrupt common fencing as a religion. The 5 Italians, who are Pietro Monte, Achille Marozzo, Camillo Agrippa, Giacomo di Grassi, and Giovanni della Gocchie. From Mallorca was Jaime Ponce de Perpignan, and the Spaniards Francisco Roman and Pedro de la Torre. And other great novel authors followed on these, on the whole, despite contradicting them in part, whose superfluous writings wander the world like letters to their vanity. And then the first one on that list is Joachim Meyer, who he calls Joachim Meyer. But the even funnier thing to me is that he has a book called Engaño y Desengaño in 1635, which means illusion and disillusion. And in that one, there are 9 seminarians of this sect. And he adds in Joachim Meyer to the list of the prime evils now, not just the followers after. So he gets a little tiny promotion in those 10 years, in Pacheco's estimation. But Pacheco, we come to find, well, so I give this presentation at a conference in Brescia, in Italy, and Manuel Valle, who's one of the main Destreza researchers, comes up to me afterwards and he's like, so how did he read that book? Because Pacheco didn't speak German. And I thought about it, and I looked at it, and nothing that he says in the book about Meyer requires him to have actually read Meyer.
Classic.
But his comments are along these lines mostly. Here's the sample. And this same prize is owed to Joachim Meyer for having translated into the German language, for the teaching of his nation, such humble thoughts, without reason or foundation, that he became fond of and satisfied by.
He's not saying anything.
No, but he is saying it in a really insulting way.
Mm-hmm.
He also described Meyer as being a translator of Marozzo, who he also hates. But he mentions one play of Meyer, except the play he describes, every detail is in this picture. So he might have had a copy of Meyer and flipped through it. In another place, he says something along the lines of, when he's talking about the Montante, he says, and Joachim Meyer managed to spend 65 pages and 20 illustrations without saying anything. So, like, he can count things, but he doesn't actually give anything of substance criticizing Meyer, except saying this is a terrible thing to do with rapier, which he might have got from the picture.
Is Pacheco Narvaez
Pacheco.
the one that had the scuffle with Quevedo supposedly?
Yeah.
That one.
Pacheco, yeah, he had problems with everybody. But there's a famous duel where he gets his hat knocked off, right? Something like that. But yeah, he also had an outsized influence on fencing in Spain
Yeah,
for
that's
like 11
common.
years.
Everything that.
So he was really important to the
Pepe.
Spanish, but he also had a mouth on him, and he was not shy about insulting everybody